Welcome back. I had like a week to spare and actually had some time to work my engine. So what I've done this week in particular is to make sure that the editor now can work with entities because the majority of the engine is now moved over to an entity component system. So instead of having like your player objects and your AI objects and your gun objects and that kind of stuff, you now got no objects whatsoever. All you've got is entities. Just create one here. So an entity in particular is simply a number. So this can be just represented with like this little thing here. It's like a three little cubes. But this represents an entity. A number is would be entity number 0 effectively. So what you do instead of creating your weapon objects and whatnot is you'll add to this entity a number of components that define what kind of data this entity holds. So for a player, we would have a like a physics component, a C-node component, and a type component basically tell this thing it's a player effectively. So this will be enough to define a player. And the nice thing is you can mix and match all these different components to an entity, and what type of components you add to that entity, what data it holds, will define how the entity operates within your game. So to make it all work, is you got your entities, your components that are added to the entity, and then you've got your systems that do all the actual functionalities. Components is nothing more than just data. So systems, like for example your physics systems, will iterate over all physics components that hold position, velocity, inertia, like all this kind of stuff, and process computations and detect collisions and that kind of stuff. And the nice thing is that your component data lives continuously in memory, meaning there are basically no gaps between the component data in memory, which makes it very cache friendly, which is the important bit because memory latency and speed is a lot slower as your processing capabilities. So processing speed pretty much increases exponentially over the years, whereas memory's only got like a linear increase, meaning that you can waste a lot of processing, but if your memory access and the way the cache, if you've got a lot of cache hits, because everything's laid out nicely in memory, your program or game will be a lot faster than traditional models that try to optimize processing speed and don't care so much where stuff lives in memory. So given an entity like this one here, we can now add stuff like we did before, like a shape. But before, wouldn't necessarily visualize the entity or the CNET component that would be created once you create a shape. We'll just show the shape. So for example, if we just got nothing selected and create a shape, you'll see it comes with the leaf that holds the mesh. Then we've got the CNET components, and then we've got the entity that that this component is a part of. So this entity holds this component, and this component will have as part of its data this mesh attached to it. So this would normally already work in the background, wouldn't show it explicitly in the editor. So now, for example, we can move around with the CNode components, and because this mesh is a child of this the CNode, it will move as CNode moves about. So similarly, before we could only add collision components to these kind of mesh components, but now I can just select the CNode and say, okay, create a cube collision. So this would be like a collision model in form of a cube. So now as well, if you move the CNode component, both of them move, and I can, as before, basically select this thing and say add a pyramid collision. And now this pyramid is a child of this mesh, whereas this one is a child of the CNodes, and this thing is a child of CNodes, and this collision is part of this bit. So if we move the CNode component, we'll see all of them moves in tandem, and if I move this thing about, you see the collision that's a child of it basically moves with it. So that's nice to have. But the most exciting thing is that because we've got the entities now defined explicitly in the editor, we can do a lot more stuff. So let me just set up a little demo. So before we had a system where we could create, say, a trigger volume. Let's set something up, little path nodes. So we could do something like where we create an entity of this thing and say, okay, link this to that path nodes and move at that speed. Because we now created a component to this entity that's a like full of path node components. It also automatically added a activate component to it, because now it can basically activate this thing. If we do so, it will start moving directly to this thing because they are linked. So if we just add a player to the mix, let's save it. You'll see that this this entity will move straight to the path node where it's linked to. Oops. However, if we make this thing not active at the beginning, but now use the trigger volume and link it to this bit and say activate it, then once we touch this thing, the entity becomes the entity's activate component gets the data set to active, and that will basically queue the path node follower system that iterates over all entities that are got an active component and a follow path component. Check if the entity is active and if the path follow component is actually linked to a path node, and if so, it will basically update the position of this cube to make sure it goes to the path node it's linked to. So we can do all that just fine, but we can now also just by mixing and matching do it in a slightly different way. So let's set up something similar again. So I've got your cube, entity, that, and a path node. So let's say we link these two together, like so. Let's set speed to 1 as before. Make sure it's not active at the beginning, otherwise it basically move its own accord. And now let's just add a entity. So I've got an entity with a CNET component, and a CNET component has as part of its data this mesh. So now we want to say once this the player interacts with this mesh, we'll basically want this cube to start moving. So what we can do now is just add components to this entity as we see fit. So it already has a CNET component because that comes with creating a shape by itself. But now we want to add a type component to it. So, okay, let's actually make sure to apply that. And then we can set the type to whatever we want. So trigger volume type means that if the trigger volume system will check for all types, all trigger volume types, and check if it's active, if it's got messages sent, and if so, if any physical component collides with it, will then send the messages that it contains. So, and the activatable one is similar, but the player now must be in the volume and press a button. So that's basically what we're gonna add now. So when that's done, so we got the type set, sync component already exists. We basically want to make sure we can activate this component, because if the component is not active, then nothing will happen. So set this thing to active. Then we want to add a message component, because we want to make sure that we can send messages to this thing. So we say we want to use this, activate it, and if we want, we can even point this thing to which node it should use if it's not set already. But this is already set up, so we don't need to do this by ourselves. And we could basically set the speed if we want to. So override the speed that's set here once the message is sent. So I think that's all we need. So let's see if this works. So if you're now going to go to the game, save it. Oh, not add a player. Of course. Let me add a player to the mix. There we go. Oh, that's not full off. So now you'll see once we intersect with this cube, we now basically get a prompt on our GUI to press E. So once we press E, we'll see the whole thing now starts moving. And this is basically done by adding just a shape and just piling on components to this entity will basically make this thing move. That's basically a nice thing about this system. The GUI needs updating a lot, but once we create an entity in the editor, we can select the entity and then just add whatever components we want. That will define what this entity is, what it can do, and the systems behind the scene will iterate over all entities of certain types, needs to have certain components, and they make sure everything works as you would expect. So that's what I've got so far. The GUI needs a massive update because currently it's a mess. But yeah, everything works as you would expect, and we can make a simple shape into an activatable component that can then send messages to different parts of the level, and we can just mix and match all these components as we see fit to get the behavior we want. And on the left, we've got some. I think we can at this point call these macros, where we'll basically create an entity with a bunch of components already set up. So as I said before, if you create a shape, create a new entity with a scene of components, and that scene of component will have a mesh already set up for it. Similarly, when you go to stuff like light, a light will also have an entity with a scene of components that is basically linked to the light, and bits will be like a light components. Also, a reason why you can make this a light component as well, and make this create light as we want. This is like a very flexible system. It's currently rather confusing given the state of the GUI interface now, but once all that is fixed up, I think I'm gonna have a lot of fun creating games using this new paradigm. So that's all I've got for now. Hope you guys enjoyed, and talk to you soon. Take care.